My name is Douglas Freeman. I am an Air Force veteran. My term of service began in 1971 and concluded in 1981. 1967 was the beginning of the ramp up in the Vietnam War, and I was a first-year law student at the time. But it was pretty clear to me that I was going to go into the service at one point or another. So I spent a little time deciding which branch would be most interesting to me. And the decision I made was the Air Force. And it was a pretty easy decision because they offered me a position as a judge advocate upon my completion of law school. So the Air Force was the place for me. And because it gave me a chance, first of all, to further my skills as a young lawyer, and also it was something I was interested in anyway. I'd always been interested in the Air Force. In fact, I had wanted, when I was in my early high school and later high school years, I wanted to be a pilot and an astronaut. Those didn't happen, but the Air Force made it close enough for my purposes. Anyway, the Air Force ROTC was the opportunity for me. And in 1967, when I joined the law school at UCLA, I also joined the Air Force ROTC at UCLA. And it was an interesting time to be in ROTC. There was a lot of turmoil on the UCLA campus. In fact, the Army ROTC had been the site of many demonstrations by students and non-students. As a result, we were prohibited from wearing our uniform during the school day, other than when we were in our ROTC class. So we'd have to go into the ROTC building, change from civies to our Air Force uniform, and then we would take class. At the end of class, we'd go back and change back into our civilian clothes. But it was a very enjoyable time for me. I particularly enjoyed the instructor, who was an Air Force major. He had been in Vietnam. He was a helicopter pilot and an interesting guy, and became actually a very close friend for many years thereafter. I lost touch with him about 15 or 20 years ago, and I've been looking for him ever since. And he was truly one of my good friends by the time I left the service. But my introduction to the service was a little bumpy because after I completed my time at UCLA and finished my ROTC, I expected to be commissioned as a captain. But before I got commissioned, I was informed that I needed to go through an interview at March Air Force Base in Riverside. And that was apparently very unusual. Everybody else got their commission upon graduation. I, however, needed to go through one more process, and I didn't know why. I went to visit the commanding officer at March Air Force Base. He was a one-star, and on his desk was a file, pretty thick file. It was a personnel file of me. And I was a little surprised that I had a personnel file that was about 1.5 inches thick. And it turned out that file contained a lot of information about my previous travels. Now, it happened that in 1967, I got married. And my bride and I traveled in Europe. And one of the locations we went to was the then Soviet Union. And I wanted to go to the Soviet Union, in part because my family was born there, and in part because I was a political scientist and historian, and I was interested in the Soviet Union political system and governance structure. So while I'm in this meeting, the commanding officer asked me why I went to the Soviet Union, and I gave him the answer I just mentioned. And he thought that was rather strange that on a honeymoon, you would take your new bride to the Soviet Union. And then he asked me why I was at the Yugoslavian former embassy in Moscow. Now, as it happened, the Yugoslavs had abandoned their embassy. They had broken away from the Soviet Union, and at that point in time, we're having some challenges between the former Yugoslav ambassador and the Soviet Union. So my appearance in that building raised the question as to why I was there. And the answer was, we went there because we were meeting with college students from the University of Moscow. But it took a while for me to explain my reasoning, and finally I was given my commission. But I thought that was kind of an interesting way to begin. I guess they feared that I was a potential spy, or there was some national security problem in my visiting on my honeymoon. In any event, my first assignment began in 1971, and I was assigned to Myrtle Beach Air Force Base. Now, that Air Force Base was a particularly interesting one. It was a training base for fighter pilots who were preparing to transition to Vietnam. But it happened to be in South Carolina, and it happened to be in a town famous for its golf courses. So the most important thing about Myrtle Beach Air Force Base is that it had two 18-hole golf courses on the base and 30 in the town of 8,000 people. So I learned to play golf pretty well while being in the Air Force, which is one of the gifts the Air Force gave me. But the most important thing about my assignment to Myrtle Beach was the work that I was asked to do. Now, I was judge advocate, which meant I handled courts martial and I handled non-legal judicial matters, but I also handled counseling and preparing the pilots and crew members to provide for their loved ones, whether they were married or they were single, by preparing wills and other documents in the event they were injured or killed. And that was an experience that actually shaped the rest of my professional career, because as a lawyer, I'm used to asking questions and preparing documents that would be helpful to whoever the client may be. In this case, it was officers and enlisted. But this time I had to actually advise them and talk to them about the consequences of death. And that was not something for which the law school prepared me. It was not something for which my training as a judge advocate prepared me. In other words, I learned I needed to be a counselor, not just a lawyer. And that skill proved to be extremely important to me, because in my next close to 36 to 40 years of practice outside the Air Force, I learned that most of my time would be spent in counseling and advising rather than preparing documents or defending individuals in court or in arbitration. I was at Myrtle Beach for 2 years, and then I was reassigned to Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama. Maxwell was one of the largest training facilities in the Air Force, and it was also the center of the Judge Advocate School. That Judge Advocate School was used to prepare lawyers who were going into the judge advocacy, and it was also used to prepare lawyers who had left the Air Force but needed refreshers. So they were in the reserves, and they would come back typically every 2 or 3 years for a refresher course at Maxwell. And that was a very interesting experience, because now I was teaching experienced lawyers more about the judge advocacy and about the Uniform Code of Military Justice. And as you may know, if anyone has ever been a teacher before, you learn far more teaching than you learn as a student. So part of the benefit of being at Maxwell and being an instructor at the Judge Advocate School was I got to really understand the Code of Military Justice. And it was a very interesting time frame for me. I learned one thing which stayed with me, and that is that the law is a tool. It's as much a guide or a parameter of behavior as it is about what happens if you create offenses. it was a very helpful period in my career development when I left the Air Force active duty in 1975. After 4 years of active duty, I was in the reserves for another 6 years. I took away two things from the Air Force. The first was that giving advice and understanding interpersonal relationships and understanding individuals at various stages of their life, some young, some old, that was a skill that I applied in my work as a tax lawyer and an estate planning attorney. Dealing with life and death was pretty common to me, and it began in the Air Force. And the second was that the law was not a bunch of rules that you needed to adhere to. It was about using those rules to implement the goals that individuals had in their own lives and to stay within the parameters of what was acceptable behavior and what was not. So I'm really grateful to the Air Force for several reasons. First, I met some amazing people, individuals that I still feel are friends. Experiences living in both South Carolina and Alabama was really enjoyable as well. Even though sometimes I felt like a fish out of water, I got the chance to meet people I would never have otherwise met or gotten to know. And third, it taught me something about what law really means and how it's actually used, and how my skills as a counselor and as an individual who had needed to understand the law, I needed to master the area of the law in which I worked. I think the most important thing about being a teacher is that you needed to know the details down to the very fine dots on the page. In order to teach, you really needed to master the concepts. And I took that with me into my business and tax and estate planning work. I had to be a master of the law, and I needed to be a counselor of my clients. So I'm grateful for all those three things: the friends I met, the training I got, and the skills that I learned. And I'm grateful for it. I, as a former Air Force officer, revere the service that others have given, including those that have sacrificed the ultimate for all of us. So I still stay connected to reserve matters and military. I have found in my business, both as a lawyer, I helped to launch a bank. I'm now running a nonprofit performing arts school. I look for former military members, enlisted and commissioned, because I know the values that move most of them and the skills and the sense of team and camaraderie that is built into being part of the military. So it was a great privilege for me. I have very fond memories, and I am grateful to participate and pleased to participate in this conversation about veterans and their experiences. I hope it's been of some interest to you, and I wish you all a very good day.